The autobiography of Malcolm X was written by Malcolm X with the assistance of author Alex Haley. Malcolm X was an African-American Muslim minister, as well as a civil rights leader. He was largely responsible for the spread of Islam throughout Black people in America. Alex Haley was an African-American author who began his writing career at Playboy magazine. The two first met when Haley was interviewing Malcolm X for an article in the magazine. In 1963, the two began meeting in a series of writing sessions in which Haley would write the autobiography and life story of Malcolm X. It recounts his life story, starting with his early childhood in rural Michigan and facing racism in his society. It then progressed through his moves to Boston, Harlem, and eventually his prison sentence, where he discovered his love of books and education. It then follows his time with the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad, and eventually his Hajj to Mecca and how that changed his outlook on life and his political opinions. This book was written because of the amount of attention that was placed on the civil rights movement in the 60s, because it was written between 1963 and 1965. And at that time, a lot of focus was put on nonviolent leaders such as Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X was seen as the more radical version and seen as more of on the fringes. And so this book was really written in an attempt to kind of spread his ideas further. These political ideas are presented throughout the book and evolve over time in conjunction with Malcolm X's own evolution of ideas throughout his lifetime. The beginning of the writing of this book comes at a very critical time in the civil rights movement in 1963. That was the year of both the March on Washington as well as the Birmingham church bombing. Malcolm X and Alex Haley were able to convey his political opinions and beliefs as well as just retell his general life story through the usage of many different types of literary techniques. One of the techniques that they used numerous times was the technique of an anecdote. One of the anecdotes that stuck out the most to me was on pages 175 and 176 in the chapter Saved. This anecdote recounts the story of how when Malcolm was in prison, he was very eager to learn and he wanted to be able to fully express himself in letters and have a higher vocabulary. So he decided to word for word rewrite the entire dictionary. I think that passage really sticks out to me, mainly just because that is a kind of absurd thing to do. But I feel like it does serve that overall purpose of trying to show how much power an education can bring you and show that you don't have to go to Harvard or even graduate from high school. You can become educated by having a dictionary in a jail cell. And I think that this theme would be especially relevant to who is most likely the target audience for this book, being poor, disenfranchised African Americans during the 60s. And to a lot of them, they wouldn't have access to some fancy, expensive education or a bunch of books. A lot of them might just have a dictionary. And it's really showing that you can take things into your own hands and you can just, having a simple dictionary, you can educate yourself and learn how to write and learn how to debate. And he later goes on to say that if someone asks him what his alma mater is, he says prison, because he believes that that's more of an honor to be able to teach yourself to be educated all on your own while being in prison than just being spoon-fed a lesson in some fancy classroom. Another literary technique that Malcolm X uses is the idea of a didactic lesson. One that stood out to me was in the chapter entitled Satan on pages 165 and 166. In this passage, he discusses his idea of Christianity and Black people. He tells a story of how they were kidnapped from their homes and taken to this new country and forced into this religion in which they're forced to worship a white man and obey a white man just because they believe that there's some sort of reward waiting for them if they obey the orders of the person who is beating them and pushing them down. And he connects this idea of following this religion, which urges them to simply be passive and accepts the racism that is inflicted upon them. And he connects these ideas and he expresses how them continuing to follow this religion, which is really only placed upon them to keep them in this place below white people, is only going to harm them. And this really shows his transition into the idea of Islam, and it also helps to push his idea of Islam because, as shown throughout the book, he is sort of a spokesperson for the religion, and so it's only fitting that he would try to help use this book to help push people towards Islam. And he does this by showing how Christianity is really just keeping them down, and how the idea of Islam, especially the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, are really there to bring them up and make them feel powerful, and not just tell them that they have to sit by and be nice and be polite to those who are abusing them. Another technique that he uses pretty frequently throughout the book is an editorialization. One example of this would be in the chapter called Icarus, from pages 284 to 285. In this passage, he recounts the story of the March on Washington, which to many people, it's seen as this big moment in the revolution, and it's seen with glory. But to him, he looks at it as very performative, and it really didn't get anything done. And throughout this passage, he narrates his opinions on what actually happened, on how this turned into this sort of idea and fantasy of marching in aggressively and taking back rights, to simply singing songs and performing speeches and everybody being peaceful and happy, when that's not what it was supposed to be, and how no politicians changed their mind on the movement afterwards, and it really did nothing. I believe him kind of adding his opinions on this and kind of attacking something that a lot of people saw to be progressive and calling it things such as the farce on Washington, and that he really didn't want integration because he believed that there was too much racism deep-rooted in society for the two races to ever be able to coexist. This also just goes along with one of the overall kind of goals of this book, which was to be able to kind of establish himself among the other civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., because it really showed how he is different in this movement, and a lot of times that's why he's overlooked, and that's why he's criticized a lot of times. And I think this is sort of him putting in his 2 cents, and why he believes that those other leaders really are not going about it the right way, and how he believes that people need to be aggressive and people need to be radical, and he believes that they can't just simply wait it out. Similar to his argument about religion, how they're not just gonna wait for a heaven to come. Why don't they fight to make their life good now? He also commonly uses the technique of reciting old speeches or letters. Most of these speeches contain knowledge that were already discussed in the book and don't present all that much new information, but a lot of times these speeches serve to be a little bit more of a Spark Notes version. An example of this would be at the end of the chapter called Mecca, on pages 347 and 348, in which he reprints a letter that he sent pretty much word for word to a lot of his friends and family members, basically talking about his Hajj to Mecca, which had already previously been covered throughout the chapter. Basically just talking about his experience, and most notably the brotherhood that he felt with other white people on this trip, which was very new to him because pretty much every other white person that he had encountered in the United States had this deep-rooted sense of racism, even if they weren't open about it and even if they acted like they were progressive. And this letter really shows his evolution, because in previous chapters he had just flat out been saying that he hated all white people, and he would tell them there was nothing that they could do to help. But this really shows a change of heart, and it also just kind of shows his own personal journey throughout his religion, and how the Hajj to Mecca, which is a major point in being a Muslim, and how it really affected him personally. And I believe that he really just kind of inserts these types of things, again, to be sort of a Spark Notes version, because a lot of his target demographic is poor, uneducated Black people, like what he once was, because he aims to empower them. And so for a lot of them, if he simply implies something, a lot of them don't have a lot of education to be able to pick up what he's meaning. So if he just straight up puts a letter where he says exactly what he felt and he states his exact opinion, he can much easily get his point across to this target demographic that he's trying to reach. This idea again helps to promote his idea of Islam, because he connects to the idea of how all of these white Muslims that he met were all just so non-racist. And he's trying to describe that in Islam, he doesn't see the deep-rooted racism that he sees in Christianity, and that all of these white Muslims simply saw him as equals. And it helps to sort of be a little bit more of a sales pitch, as he's done throughout this book, for the idea of the Nation of Islam. When thinking about the cumulative effects of this book, I have to understand that I am not the target demographic for this book. I was born 40 years after the civil rights movement. I grew up white and middle class and Christian in worlds that I've never seen it be segregated. And so I have to understand that this book was not written for me. But I still do think it's very relevant, and I can see a lot of parallels between the book and modern day contexts and issues. I think for me personally, one of the most relevant ideas is the idea that pacifism really is not a solution to any type of issue like this. How simply being performative is not going to get something done. And performative activism is rampant throughout our society. Like when the NFL prints "end racism" in their end zones, but yet 4 years earlier, they were oppressing the Colin Kaepernick protests. Especially now, when to be seen as non-racist is the norm, a lot of people and a lot of companies will try to put on a big show and talk about how progressive they are and how non-racist they are, when really, they're not doing anything. And that's sort of what he talks about a lot in this book, and how people really need to actually come together and actually fight for things that matter, instead of just holding hands and singing songs and saying that you care and proceeding to not do anything real. Although on the flip side, I do recognize that, especially towards the beginning of the book, he's very absolute in his very extreme beliefs, that a lot of times for a reader who might not believe exactly the same, it makes it very hard to be able to see his points or emphasize, because he's so steadfast in this belief that he believes that if you're not with him, you're against him. And so it's hard to empathize with a person who believes that you're against him. Especially in the book, when he makes some very anti-Semitic comments, and when people try to attack him on that, he really just brushes them off. Like, he can't accept the criticism, and he can't accept that a lot of people don't feel the same way. And he takes that as a personal attack. But you can also see while reading this book that it definitely would have been influential to much of what their target audience likely was, which was lower class Black Americans who often didn't have access to a good education and who are constantly being pushed down in the system by white racism. Malcolm X is like a success story. He's someone who came from rural Michigan, who had nothing, whose father was killed by racists, and how he went on and he tried to adapt to white society and simply couldn't. And he followed every single negative stereotype that a white person would have had for a Black person at the time. He moved to Harlem. He sold drugs. He went to prison. And despite all of this, he educated himself all on his own from a prison cell. He was able to gain worldwide recognition, travel all over the world, and meet with numerous different leaders. And he's trying to show them the power that his education has brought him, as well as the power that the Nation of Islam had brought him. And he had said that he owed everything that he had to Allah. A lot of this book served to be sort of a rallying cry to these type of disenfranchised Black people. And it also shows them that they need to fight not only for themselves, that they need to work hard to educate themselves and find opportunities, but they also need to fight for their own rights, because they can't just sit around and wait for politicians to take pity upon them, or just sit around and sing songs and hope that it's going to bring about some progress. That they need to stand up and actively go against all that the white people have expected from them. Because Malcolm X could have easily just been a drug dealer for the rest of his life, but instead he turned around and decided to stand up and fight. And this really is a rallying cry saying, you can do this, and you should do this, because this is what's right.